Ranger found the old man before Wade did. That was not unusual. Ranger found most things before Wade did. It was, in fact, the reason Wade had been given the dog in the first place, 2 years earlier, when a retiring U.S. Forest Service search and rescue coordinator had placed Ranger's brown and orange collar in Wade's hands and said the dog had more search hours logged in these Idaho mountains than any 2 handlers combined, and that it would be a waste to retire him to a house. Wade had been in the right place for a different kind of waste to be avoided. But on this particular September morning, in the old-growth Douglas fir above the Clearwater River, Ranger was not doing search and rescue. He had stopped at the edge of a wolf den site with one paw raised and his reddish-gold coat slightly raised along the spine, and he was looking at a Nez Perce man crouching 30 feet away, photographing something on the ground. The man had not heard Wade approach. People rarely did. Wade looked at what Ranger had brought him to. 2 ravens dead near the den entrance. A 3rd crow dead 10 yards west. A scatter of secondary victims, the specific pattern of secondary poisoning, where animals that had eaten a poisoned primary target died in turn. He had seen this pattern before. Not in Idaho. In places he did not discuss with people he had not served alongside. He looked at Ranger. Ranger looked at the den. The Nez Perce man finally turned and saw Wade standing 8 feet behind him. He did not startle. He looked at Wade and then at the dog with the specific unhurried assessment of someone who had spent many years outdoors. He said, "You track quiet." Wade said, "So do you." The old man looked back at the dead ravens. He said, "They have been doing this for 2 years." Wade Callister had served 20 years in the United States Marine Corps as a force reconnaissance operator, the most elite reconnaissance specialty in the Marine Corps, men who operated in small teams deep in denied territory to gather information that conventional forces could not safely obtain. He was 57 years old. Lean and sun-weathered with the kind of fitness that came from decades of living in terrain. His hair had gone fully gray and he kept it cut short from habit. His eyes were dark brown and read everything, terrain, light, distance, human posture and intention, with the reflexive efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years in environments where reading these things accurately was a requirement for survival. He had left the Marines 4 years ago. Not from injury and not from anything as simple as enough. He had simply reached the point where the particular skills he had were needed more in a place he could actually reach than in the classified operations that had occupied the last decade of his career. He had come to Clearwater County, Idaho, for a reason that was difficult to explain and that he had not attempted to explain to anyone. The mountains here were the right kind of mountains. Dense, steep, uncompromising. The kind that required actual skill to move through rather than simply endurance. He had bought a small piece of land outside the town of Nez Creek, built a modest cabin on it, and begun working as a wilderness guide for hunters and hikers who needed someone who actually knew how to move through backcountry. He was good at this. He was good at most things that required precision and silence in difficult terrain. Ranger had come with the territory in a way that felt deliberate even though it had been coincidental. The retiring Forest Service coordinator who had placed the dog with Wade had said only that Ranger had been trained for wilderness search and rescue, that his nose was exceptional, that he had logged more operational hours in the Clearwater National Forest than any other working dog in the program's history, and that he was 9 years old and still had years of work left in him if someone gave him something worth doing. Wade had given him something worth doing every day since. They moved through the forest together the way the best teams move, without a great deal of communication, with a great deal of mutual understanding, each reading the other's pace and attention and adjusting accordingly. Ranger worked ahead in the dense timber, finding the lines of least resistance, the places where the ground said something worth noting. Wade followed and read what Ranger showed him. He had been guiding in this country for 3 years when he first noticed something was wrong on the federal land above the Clearwater drainage. Ranger had noticed first, as he always did. A behavioral change, a specific alertness at certain locations that was different from his normal working attention. The alertness of a dog who had found a category of problem he recognized. Wade had started paying attention to those locations. The man crouching at the wolf den was named Thomas Yellowbird. He was a Nez Perce tribal wildlife monitor who had been assigned to document wildlife activity on the adjacent federal land since the treaty consultation process had been renewed 3 years earlier. He carried a field notebook that was his third of the current season and a small digital recorder that was clipped to his jacket pocket. They sat together at the base of a large fir tree while Ranger moved the perimeter of the den site, and Thomas told Wade what he had been documenting for 2 years. The hunting outfitter operation was called Clearwater Trophy Outfitters. It was owned by a man named Derek Payne who had purchased the private land adjacent to the federal wilderness boundary 4 years ago and built a luxury hunting lodge operation catering to out-of-state clients willing to pay significant sums for guaranteed trophy kills. The guaranteed part was the problem. The federal land above Payne's property was a designated wilderness area. Hunting was regulated. Trophy success rates in regulated wilderness were inherently variable because the wildlife was unmanaged. Derek Payne had decided to manage it. Over 2 years, Thomas had documented wolf den poisoning at 3 confirmed sites on federal land adjacent to Payne's hunting corridor. He had photographed secondary poisoning casualties, recorded GPS coordinates, and documented the pattern of increased ungulate density in Payne's hunting zone following each incident, prey animals that had moved into the area after their natural predators were eliminated. He had filed 2 reports with the U.S. Forest Service. Both had been reviewed by the district office. Both had been determined insufficient for further investigation. Thomas believed, and told Wade with the specific precision of someone who had thought about this carefully, that the district office supervisor was a personal friend of Derek Payne. Wade listened to all of this. When Thomas finished, he asked 3 questions. Thomas answered each one from his field notebook. Then the sound of an ATV came through the timber from the northeast. Ranger's coat rose slightly along the spine and he moved to stand beside Wade, amber eyes on the tree line. 2 men came out of the trees on an ATV. They wore Clearwater Trophy Outfitters gear. They saw Thomas and stopped. The larger of the 2 men got off the ATV and walked toward Thomas. He said Thomas was on private land and was trespassing. Thomas said he was not, he had the GPS coordinates of the federal boundary on his recorder. The man said the recorder looked like it was broken. He reached out and knocked it from the clip on Thomas's jacket. It hit a rock. The second man looked at Wade. He looked at Ranger. Ranger had not moved. He was standing broadside between Wade and the 2 men, absolutely still, reddish-gold coat raised along the spine. No sound from the dog. Amber eyes on the large man near Thomas. The large man looked at the dog. He picked up the recorder from the rock and put it in his pocket. He said Thomas should think carefully about where he spent his time. They got back on the ATV and drove northeast. Thomas looked at his recorder in the man's pocket, then at Wade. Wade had photographed both men's faces on his phone during the exchange. He had photographed the ATV's registration number. He had noted the time. He said, "Walk me through everything you have documented. From the beginning." Over the following 3 days, Wade and Ranger moved through the federal wilderness above the Clearwater drainage with Thomas's documented GPS coordinates and the methodical patience that force reconnaissance training had built into Wade over 2 decades. Ranger worked. The dog moved through the dense Idaho timber in the specific pattern of a trained detection animal, covering the ground systematically, reading the air at each location Thomas had documented. At 2 of the 3 confirmed poisoning sites, Ranger indicated, the raised paw, the fixed attention, the specific sit that meant the category of problem he recognized was still present in the ground. At the second site, he found something Thomas had not known was there. Buried beneath 8 inches of forest soil, wrapped in plastic, a poison bait cache. Still sealed. Additional material for future use. Wade photographed it without disturbing it. He photographed the surrounding terrain. He documented the GPS location. He flagged the position with a small orange marker pressed to the underside of a root so it was invisible from above but locatable by coordinate. He had done this kind of documentation before. In other countries. Under other circumstances. The chain of custody methodology was the same regardless of what was being documented. He called Thomas that evening from his cabin. He told Thomas what Ranger had found. He told Thomas about the sealed cache. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said, "They will file a complaint against your guiding license." Wade said he understood. Thomas said, "They did it to the last person who asked questions. He was a local biologist." He lost his Forest Service contract. Wade said he had read about that. Thomas said, "Why are you doing this?" Wade thought about this. He said, "Ranger found it. That's my answer." Thomas was quiet for another moment. He said, "The Forest Service district supervisor will sit on any complaint I make." Wade said he knew. He said there were other channels. 2 days later, the complaint arrived. Not against Wade's guiding license, against his land use permit, which allowed his guiding operation to access the federal wilderness trails. The complaint cited unauthorized wildlife interference, and was filed with the district office. A letter arrived from the district office acknowledging receipt. The district supervisor's name was on the letterhead. Wade read the letter once. He put it on the table. Ranger came and pressed against his leg. Wade rested his hand on the dog's reddish-gold coat. He said, "All right." He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Law Enforcement Office in Boise, not the regional field office, which reported to the same department structure as the Forest Service District, but the Federal Law Enforcement Division directly. He had the number because he had looked it up 2 days earlier. The second call was to a former Marine colleague who had left the service and was now a federal prosecutor in Portland. Wade had served with him for 4 years. He was a man who understood chain of custody documentation. Both calls were answered. He sent the photographs, the GPS coordinates, and his documentation file to both recipients that evening. The following morning, Derek Payne arrived at Wade's cabin. He drove a black truck with Clearwater Trophy Outfitters livery on the doors. He got out alone, which told Wade something about how Payne had assessed the situation. He was a broad red-faced man in expensive hunting gear. He walked to the cabin porch with the authority of someone who had never been told no by anyone with the power to make it stick. He said he understood Wade had been spending time on the federal land above his property. Wade said he guided in that area regularly. Payne said some activities in that area created problems for legitimate business operations in the county and that he hoped Wade understood the value of being a good neighbor. Wade said he appreciated good neighbors. Ranger was at the cabin window. Wade did not call him out. Payne looked at the window. He could see the dog watching. He said he wanted to be direct. He said he had relationships in this county that went back 30 years, and that a man who was new to the area and was stirring up problems based on an old Indian's notebook was going to find the county a difficult place to operate in. Wade said he had heard that. Payne waited for more. Nothing came. He said, "You were military." Wade said, "Yes." Payne said, "What branch?" Wade said, "Marines." Payne nodded as if this explained something. He said he respected service. He said he hoped Wade would think about what he was getting into. He drove away. Ranger watched the truck go from the window. Wade went inside. He photographed the truck's license plate from the security camera footage he had begun running 3 days earlier. He uploaded the footage clip to the same file he had sent to Boise and Portland. He called Thomas. He said, "They know what we have. They'll move faster now." Thomas said, "So should we." The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement team arrived on a Wednesday morning. 2 agents in federal vehicles, a wildlife forensic specialist, and a Forest Service law enforcement officer from the regional office, not the district office. Wade met them at the trailhead at 6 in the morning with Ranger. Thomas was already there. They moved into the federal wilderness in the cold Idaho morning, Ranger ahead as always, the team following. The buried cache was where Wade had marked it. The agents documented it in place before removing it. The forensic specialist confirmed on-site the chemical composition matched a compound used in several other documented wolf poisoning cases in the region. At the second site, Ranger indicated a secondary location that had not been in Thomas's notes. Wade had not been to this exact point before. The forensic team worked it and found evidence of a burial that had been recently excavated, something retrieved before the team could find it. But the residual contamination was documentable. The team spent 6 hours on the federal land. Derek Payne's attorney called the district supervisor's office at noon. The district supervisor attempted to contact the Fish and Wildlife law enforcement team to discuss jurisdiction. The team's supervising agent took the call and noted it in the record. That evening, Payne drove to Thomas's house in Nez Creek. He did not get out of the truck. He sat in the driveway. Thomas called Wade. Wade drove to Thomas's house. He arrived 8 minutes later. He pulled up behind Payne's truck and parked. He got out. Ranger dropped to the ground beside him. Wade walked to the driver's window of Payne's truck. He knocked on the glass. Payne lowered the window. His red face was less easy than it had been at the cabin. Wade said, "The federal team has what they need. You sitting in this man's driveway is now going to be in my report of today's activities." Payne said, "Who are you?" Wade said, "A wilderness guide." Payne looked at Ranger. Ranger was standing at Wade's side, amber eyes on Payne, reddish gold coat very still. Payne drove away without saying anything else. Inside Thomas's house, over tea, Thomas asked Wade the same question Payne had asked. He said, "Who are you?" "Before Idaho. Before the guiding." Wade thought about this. He said, "Force reconnaissance. 20 years. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is why you know how to document evidence correctly." Wade said, "Chain of custody methodology is the same regardless of the environment." Thomas said, "And the dog?" Wade said, "Forest Service search and rescue. 9 years in these mountains. He knows more about this land than I do." Thomas looked at Ranger sitting at Wade's boot. He said, "He found the cache." Wade said, "He finds everything." Thomas looked at his field notebook, third of the season, full of 2 years of careful observation. He said, "I thought I would run out of time before anyone listened." Wade said, "Ranger listened." The federal case moved through the administrative and legal process over the following months. Derek Payne's Clearwater Trophy Outfitters operation was suspended pending investigation. The district supervisor who had reviewed Thomas's earlier complaints was placed on administrative leave while a conflict of interest review was conducted. The Forest Service regional office took over the district's oversight. The buried poison cache that Ranger had found was confirmed as the fourth documented instance of illegal predator elimination on the federal land corridor. Federal charges were filed. Thomas continued his wildlife monitoring work under a renewed tribal consultation agreement with the Regional Forest Service office. His field notebook, the third of the season and the one whose recorder had been knocked to the rock, was submitted as evidence. The digital recorder, which had been placed in Payne's employee's pocket, was recovered by the federal team during the evidence collection process and found to have continued recording through the fall on the rock. Wade did not attend any of the proceedings. He was in the backcountry most of that autumn, guiding hunters on the federal land that was now being properly monitored, moving through the same timber with Ranger at his side. One evening in late October, he made camp at a location above the Clearwater that he had been to many times. He made a fire. Ranger moved the camp perimeter and returned. The forest was very quiet. The kind of quiet that Idaho wilderness achieves in the late fall, absolute and complete and inhabited only by what belongs there. Thomas had sent him a message that afternoon. The wolf pack that had used the poison den sites had been observed in the drainage again. A camera trap had caught them 3 days earlier, 7 animals, including 2 juveniles. Wade read the message twice. He put his phone in his pocket. Ranger came and pressed against his leg. Wade rested his hand on the dog's reddish gold coat and looked at the fire. The forest had been here before Derek Payne. It would be here after. The wolves in the drainage had survived what had been done to their pack. The old man with the field notebook had been right all along. And the dog had known where to look. Wade and Ranger remind us of something that the wilderness itself has always known. The land remembers. It holds what is done to it in its soil and its silences, in the absence of sound where sound should be, in the behavior of an animal who reads what human eyes cannot. Ranger moved through that Idaho forest the way he has always moved, covering the ground, paying attention, showing his handler what the ground was saying. Thomas had been saying the same thing for 2 years. He had the notebook and the coordinates and the patience of a man who has studied the same forest through every season for decades. What he needed was someone who knew how to translate that knowledge into something that could not be set aside. And a dog who already knew where to look. If Wade and Ranger's story stayed with you today, drop an amen in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that some people choose to show up for places and for people that are not their official responsibility. Subscribe, because we have more stories like this one every week. God bless you. And God bless the ones who still know how to read the land.